Guess who's back? Back again. Courtland Sutton's back. So Broncos Country, tell a friend. We'll tell you what the impact of Courtland Sutton returning at Broncos mandatory minicamp this week will be for Bo Nix and the other quarterbacks on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode of Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you once again to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day. Every single day, you can get this show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. So make sure you subscribe or follow so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team every single day, all year long. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports. I cover the team in person in Dove Valley every single day. Joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger. He's the site expert over there at predominantlyorange.com. Check out his written work over there as we bring you all the Broncos news, content, coverage, analysis, and more that you need every single day, all year long. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Sarah, it's a big week here for the Broncos. Mandatory minicamp begins on Tuesday in Dove Valley. We get access to 3 straight days of practice, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Then the players are going to be off for about 5 weeks. And then it is training camp time. Look, everything's getting real here in Broncos Country, but nothing bigger than what we're going to kick off on today's episode of the show. Courtland Sutton is returning to practice after not appearing at the team's voluntary OTAs. He's been training in Florida, but now he's back, and he's going to be able to get some work this week with Bo Nix, Jarrett Stidham, and Zach Wilson.
He is, and he revealed on the DNVR Broncos podcast that he would be coming back, and amidst other things, I know he's been in Denver. I think he's got an event going on this week, Cody, with I think it's like softball or something like that. So he seemed to be in really good spirits too. Like it doesn't feel like he's kind of begrudgingly coming back because he's going to be getting fined or anything like that. When you listen to Courtland in that interview that he did with the DNVR guys, I mean, you could tell like it's been bothering him to be away, and he's excited to come back, and he's excited to be out there with his teammates again. And he's really just driven. I think that it was a great opportunity for all of us, I think, to kind of hear like what it means to Courtland Sutton to get this team back to winning ways, because as far as he knows, the greatness of the Denver Broncos franchise is history because he came to the team in 2018. The team was already a couple of years removed from its last winning season, a couple of years removed from Super Bowl 50, and they've been one of the worst teams in the NFL since 2018, unfortunately. And so what Courtland knows about the history of the Broncos is this, rich tradition and all this winning and things like that. He's never been part of that in Denver, but you can tell he's excited to get back. You can tell that he's excited to get this team to a winning record as quick as possible, to get them on par with the Chiefs in the AFC. And it was just great to hear all of those things. And I think that attitude coming in, that leadership that he brings to the table may be the most important thing that he's bringing back onto and off of the field.
Well, and it's big for Courtland as well because, look, Courtland has been painted as this villain in the eyes of so many in Broncos Country because he's not showing up to voluntary workouts. And more importantly, like he's asking for more money. He's not asking for more money. He's asking for more guaranteed money. He doesn't have a lot of that left on his current contract. And you look at what he's been able to do. The market every year for every position is changing. And Courtland put together one of his best seasons as a pro. And it's not necessarily about the amount of yards, but 10 touchdown catches. I mean, you talk about a couple of the catches he made this season, including some of the touchdown catches that he made, helped the Broncos during that winning streak that put them back in the conversation of, hey, they're in playoff contention here. And that's where I just think a lot of people look at the financial side of it. NFL teams do players dirty all the time, right? So when a player's like, hey, I know my value, I know my worth, I want to do it. A lot of times now people vilify the player for doing what's best for them when teams do what's best for them all the time. So, I mean, it's just, there's a lot of double standards in terms of how players and obviously how NFL teams operate and maneuver. It doesn't seem like that stuff is really getting in the way right now. And now, obviously, him reporting back to practice this week, beginning on Tuesday at Broncos Park, powered by Common Spirit. That's a mouthful right there, I tell you. The thing is like, yeah, financially, you don't want to take any more hits to your wallet there. And like, that's when the fines get a little bit bigger. Courtland has not been fined in any way, shape, or form for not appearing in voluntary workouts. I mean, that would be illegal by the NFL, be a violation of the CBA, but he is going to be there. Part of me is wondering, though, it's like he had a lot of great things to say about Bo Nix. He mentioned that Bo has this aura about him. And I think this is a different dynamic than what we've seen in terms of Courtland being able to work with guys, right? I think the last guy who was young and had a little bit of excitement to him at the quarterback position for the Broncos in recent memory. I mean, Sayre, it's been Drew Lock. And look, granted, we all know how that thing went right there. Where Bo's at versus where Drew's at, I feel like are entirely different. I think there's a strong level of maturity there. I mean, we go back to Vic Fangio's comments about Drew. He said something about, what was the baseball analogy he made?
Pitcher.
He doesn't, he puts a lot of velocity on it, but he's got like this gunslinger mentality. Bo Nix is very smart, calculated. I don't think that Bo's fit in comparison to where Drew is. I think the team is in a different realm. You can't compare Drew to Bo in any way, shape, or form. But I do think that Bo is coming into a better situation with the Broncos than Drew was coming into with Denver at his time. And I'm very, very curious to see how Courtland is either a big part of that or, if there's other guys that do emerge here. But it is good to have the guy who caught 10 touchdown passes last season, your top leading receiver, back at practice. And also when it happens for training camp, look, you're only going to get 3 days this week. I'm curious to see if Bo, Jarrett, Zach, Courtland, and the receivers after this break here, mandatory minicamp, if they're going to go throw in the offseason right before training camp. I mean, obviously you want to reset, but you don't want to take 5 weeks off and do nothing. I think that's a pain point here we'll talk about.
Yeah, I got to find a way to gain that edge in the offseason, right? And I think what you mentioned is so important. The difference between, the excitement over Drew Lock, which was largely from the fan base and maybe from the front office at the time, not from the head coach. That's the big difference this time around, is that we know Vic Fangio did not like Drew Lock. I know he never explicitly said that, but I mean, the happy birthday Teddy Bridgewater day, if anybody hasn't seen that clip, go ahead and look it up, when Vic Fangio did not like Drew Lock, and I think from the beginning we could tell that. He called him, like you alluded to, Cody, a pitcher who doesn't know how to pitch. Whereas you've got Sean Payton out there saying that Bo Nix is like a boring golfer out there because he's just so good at what he does. And it's like, how does he get that good at that? Like, he makes it look easy is what he was trying to say. And your coach being behind the young quarterback is a major difference. It's a huge, huge shift in the locker room, on the field. The players don't have to question, like, are we supposed to get behind this guy or are we not? Like, who are we supposed to rally behind? I think if you're in this Denver Broncos locker room, that it's going to be Bo Nix eventually, and we're just kind of all waiting for that to happen. So with Courtland out there, that'll be the most exciting clip that I can already picture Twitter or X or whatever you're calling it these days, Cody, when people are seeing that clip of Bo Nix throwing a pass. Doesn't matter if it's short, long, whatever. When he throws that first pass to Courtland Sutton and Bo Nix getting that connection going and people seeing video footage of it, I think the fans are going to go absolutely crazy, as optimism seems to already be brewing quite a bit, doesn't it? I mean, that's kind of the vibe that I'm getting, is that people are a little more optimistic day by day in Broncos country, and seeing your leader offensively, the guy who was your best offensive skill player last year, seeing him back out there with that rookie quarterback, man, that's going to ramp up the optimism level, I mean, tenfold at this point.
Well, let the optimism flow, Broncos country. Like, this is a time to be excited because every year is different, right? Last year really doesn't matter in hindsight. Next year, we're not even focused on next year. You got to be focused on the present moment. Every year we've seen it in the NFL. A team who's done terrible has turned it around. A team who's been great suddenly is terrible. The carousel keeps going on. That's why we always watch the NFL every single year, even if it has to do with your favorite team or doesn't have anything to do with your favorite team. We all tune in. We all talk about it. Could the Broncos be conversation starters this year? That's the hope. And obviously things will be great for everybody here in Broncos country if that is the case. But Courtland Sutton returning to mandatory minicamp, returns to practice here on Tuesday. And speaking of Tuesday's practice, players that we'll have our eye on include Ja'Quan McMillian, who's been on a hot streak during OTAs. Right now, he's firmly in place in that cornerback 2 conversation. We'll tell you why and see if he can keep that streak up here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. Broncos Country, today's episode, Locked On Broncos, is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel Sportsbook. And as you all know, at FanDuel, they are America's #1 sportsbook. And look, as we get a little bit closer to the month of July, we're getting close to summertime. And summertime means baseball. It means the NBA Finals and more. And you can bet it all on FanDuel. And right now, new customers, they get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. So if you sign up as a brand new customer here today and you place a $5 bet anywhere and it wins, you're automatically going to get $200 in bonus bets. That's $200 that you can use to bet everything from Finals MVP, who wins the NBA Finals, or to who's going to hit it one out of the park during one of your favorite baseball games that you're going to be watching. So make sure you visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Once again, that's FanDuel.com/lockedon and add a big win to your summer bucket list. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook.
It could be an unexpected player that takes a hold of that cornerback 2 position opposite Pat Surtain in the 2024 season. Ja'Quan McMillan, if he has another strong week at mandatory minicamp, man, we might be talking about him in this starting defense, but not playing in the slot. And can he hold off some other guys? We're going to talk about that on today's episode of Locked On Broncos, but want to say thank you and give a shout out to all of you who make Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, where you know it's your team every day, free and available everywhere that you listen to podcasts, as well as on YouTube, where you can watch the show and engage with other members of Broncos Country. And hey, if you've been watching national sports media shows and you're sick of them not talking about the Denver Broncos, you can get curated local coverage with the Locked On Sports Network. In fact, Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and it's also available on the Fire TV app. And Locked On Sports Today, it's going to be here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with local experts of Locked On, plus national shows covering every single league. So go ahead, find Locked On Sports Today, now available in the Fire TV channels app. Let's talk about a player that's on fire, Cody. Ja'Quan McMillian. I know you've been talking about him. We've been talking about him since he was signed as an undrafted player. And we're like, how the heck did this guy who was an All-American at East Carolina, of all places, not get drafted coming into the league? And we're seeing, after he had that year to develop, got a little opportunity in his rookie season, last year's breakout year for him. I think Ja'Quan is a player that not many expected to necessarily take that next step into being a starter on the outside cornerback position. But tell people maybe what you've seen and why you think that he can keep this hot streak in the 2024 offseason going.
Yeah, well, a lot of it, you mentioned his year that he had last year, and I think we are all in agreement, especially after the injury to K'Wan Williams. We're like, all right, the Broncos have their long-term nickel guy here in Ja'Quan McMillian. Well, now, come to think of it, it's like, all right, Jim Leonhard gets hired by the Broncos to be the team's defensive backs coach, replacing Christian Parker, but he also gets thrown an additional title, right? The 2 titles, which tend to be the most interesting. Guys with 2 titles to their name in terms of coaching have a lot more responsibility. There is something to be following there in terms of tea leaves. But when you look at defensive backs coach, you also look at passing game coordinator. So when it comes to the Broncos defense, in terms of what plays are called and how it fits within the structure of what Vance Joseph is doing, the passing game coordinator is highly responsible for ensuring that the pass defense, outside of him just coaching defensive backs, but the structure of it, the disguise, and even the calls that they have, execute properly in season on the field. And when you look at where Jim Leonhard has come into, and obviously a lot of excitement, we heard from PJ Locke last week after Broncos wrapped up their OTA practices, talking about that there's just like a new excitement, right? It's nothing against Christian Parker in any way, shape, or form, but this is a guy who's played in the NFL for a multi years, played 10 plus seasons in the National Football League, understands coverages and concepts really well. And now he's embracing what we have called on this show positional versatility, where you're having guys play inside and outside. So when we attended the first week of Broncos OTAs and I was looking at Ja'Quan McMillian, I'm like, all right, hey, there's Ja'Quan inside the nickel. He's inside the slot. And then the next defensive series, he's playing outside corner. I'm like, ooh, I kind of like this. Like, this is something that I had, we kind of threw some questions out before OTAs began. Will we see something like that? We didn't think we'd see that with Ja'Quan. We thought we'd see it more so with the safety and some other positions. Well, now we're seeing guys who play on the outside, play on the inside, guys who play on the inside, play on the outside, and vice versa. They're rotating those roles. And Ja'Quan has been the guy who's been the most consistent in terms of when there's a football thrown, you see number 29. He's either there, pass breaking it up, he's in coverage, or he cuts off a route to where, it falls to become an incomplete pass. There's one play where Lucas Kroll did get him, and that was during the first week of OTAs. Second week, he comes up and has a big PBU against Lucas Kroll at the last minute to knock it away, force down an incomplete pass on when the Broncos offense was in their third down period there. And all of a sudden, Ja'Quan's this guy you're seeing him make plays. You're seeing his name called quite a bit. I'm sitting there on the sideline and I'm listening to the coaches and they're saying, Quan, like 29, he's in there. I can't give away what they're saying, but basically, it sounds like Ja'Quan McMillian has had a heavy workload on his plate during OTAs, and he's doing really well with it. To me, Sayre, that is a huge sign in terms of maybe, okay, this is a guy who probably, as we've talked about guys like Levi Wallace, Riley Moss, and these other guys at corner, Damari Mathis, we never really talked too much about Ja'Quan, but now Ja'Quan, in my opinion, at least going into mandatory minicamp, and if he continues that hot streak this week, he'll be the favorite to get the starting job at cornerback 2 on the outside, opposite of Pat. But he's going to be able to move around as well, which, as we said, is better news for the defense.
Let's think about it from this perspective, too. I mean, if you're the Denver Broncos coaching staff, you have to boil it down to maybe something as simple as this. Maybe they're not boiling it down this simple, but I'm going to throw it out there. That other position opposite PS2, you've got to be able to trust that guy to take on roughly at least probably 80 to 100 targets this season. I mean, that position is going to be targeted heavily because teams do tend to avoid throwing the ball at Pat Surtain. I mean, that's just the reality of the situation. So when you think about it, that other outside cornerback position is somebody that the Broncos coaching staff has to think, all right, whoever is over there is going to be getting targeted 80 to 100 times this coming year. And who do we trust the most with that many opportunities of the ball coming his direction? So why not Ja'Quan McMillian? Fabian Moreau was the guy last year. He's gone and he's not coming back. Levi Wallace has started in the NFL, but then I don't necessarily think that he has the same type of upside, quite frankly, as Ja'Quan McMillian, who's a younger player, who's coming off of a better season and was, at times he was dominant last year. He was doing everything, playing the ball. And so when you're talking about, okay, they're going to get a lot of targets on that side of the field, who do we trust the most? I think that's a huge factor when it comes to him potentially playing at the outside cornerback position, because he has proven that when the ball is thrown his way, that he's going to make plays. We saw it in a small sample size on the outside playing against a guy who's 7 inches taller than him, and Mike Williams with the Chargers. And we saw it when he played in the nickel, in the slot. We've seen him cover against tight ends. We've seen him do all these different things. And he makes up for that lack of size with anticipation, with ball instincts, the same things that we said, man, how do you get 9 interceptions or 8 interceptions or whatever it was at East Carolina? Not to disrespect, I don't mean to continually disrespect the East Carolina Pirates program, but I'm saying to become an All-American there is very, very difficult for him to do that. And to make all those plays on the ball, you got to have instincts. You got to make the right break on the ball. You got to do great in your film study to be able to read the quarterback, and you got to have hands, and he's got all those things. So maybe it's not such a crazy idea.
I don't think it's a crazy idea one bit, just knowing the level of preparation. As we mentioned, before he got his first career start against Mike Williams and the Chargers in that Week 18 game, I did talk to Broncos former defensive backs coach, now Philadelphia Eagles passing game corner, DB coach Christian Parker. Talked to him last year, and he said, really, Ja'Quan just studied. He was on the practice squad, but he was in those meetings as if he was a starter. He put together his game plan, his study guide on the receivers, the teams, he would do a scouting report and would give that to CP. And CP knew, hey, this guy, he's going to be ready. That's how Ja'Quan prepared, right? Because when you're undrafted, you have a chip on your shoulder. You're trying to fight for a spot. And we see stories every year. And for some reason, the Broncos have had a great string of history on undrafted guys coming out and thriving. Ja'Quan, one of the latest and greatest outside of Jaleel McLaughlin in terms of recent hype, in terms of production. He's going to be in a good position, I feel like, Sayre, to be the cornerback too. But in certain situations, if you feel like he's going to be more beneficial covering a guy in the slot, you match him up there. You think he's going to cover well on the outside, you match him up there. Ja'Quan is ready for it. And out of all the Broncos defensive backs, and this isn't taken away from anybody here, but I do feel like Pat and Ja'Quan are the top two guys in that secondary. When we talk about the cornerback position, I think they're more polished than the other guys, and the other guys have still room to climb up the ladder a little bit and still develop. I just think Ja'Quan's ahead of the pack here, which isn't a bad thing, but we'll see how things translate here at mandatory minicamp this week. Ja'Quan, a player that we have our eyes on here, but another player we have our eyes on. Broncos head coach Sean Payton told us we should see him before training camp, so that means that should be this week. Will Greg Dulcich return to the practice field this week? We'll tell you why he needs to on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. Will Greg Dulcich return this week after having offseason foot surgery? There's a chance he's back on the practice field as the Broncos tight end competition heats up at mandatory minicamp. Once again, thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country, all the everydayers out there for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day every single day. Mandatory minicamp here this week. 3 days of being able to watch practice. Locked On Broncos is the place that you need to be afterwards, so you get all the coverage of everything that you need to know as to who stood out, who didn't stand out, who's trending upward as training camp is right around the corner. You get that here, Locked On Broncos exclusively. Sayre, we've talked a lot about the tight end position. We've talked about Lucas Kroll and Adam Troutman really being those two headline guys there. And the main conversation surrounding Greg Dulcich really this offseason has been around the hypothetical, can he stay healthy? And look, we don't have the answer to that question just yet, but if you're looking at where things have been, a lot of fans, if you ask them that, they're going to say no. And I think so much of this has changed the conversation, has changed the mindset on Greg Dulcich to where I think a lot of people forget when healthy, he's a really good player. He's a difference maker. He has game changer potential there, but everyone's clouded on, well, this guy hasn't stayed healthy. And I think it's fair to be like cautious, right? To be like, I don't know, like we haven't seen this guy stay healthy, but I think because of the injury history, so many people have forgotten how good Greg can be. Now, let's operate here under this hypothetical. Greg stays healthy this season. I can see a lot of exciting things here for the Broncos, especially at the tight end position with Lucas Kroll and even Adam Troutman in a rotational role. I think that Denver, if Dulcich can stay healthy, they're better at tight end than they were last season, which isn't really saying much, but there's a lot of potential and excitement about that room. And it all stems along the question, will we see Greg Dulcich this week? I want to get your prediction here. Do you think we see him Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday?
I think we will at some point. I feel like Sean Payton would have kind of shut it down a little bit more last week when he met the media and he was asked about Dulcich if that wasn't going to be the case. Now he didn't come out and say, "Oh yeah, you're going to see him out there at mandatory minicamp." Now he would never do that because you just never know. But I do think we're going to see him out there because I feel like Greg is itching to come back. It sounds like he was practicing out on the side field as well, Cody, which we know from in-season practice reports that if you're practicing on the side field, you're probably getting ready to come back fairly soon. And so I think that's a sign that he's getting ready to come back. And I do agree with you. I think that the offense, if I can say this is a hot take, I guess, the offense as a whole is going to be way better if Greg Dulcich is out there. And I don't want to say that he was an immediate game changer as a rookie, but he was an immediate impact player when he came out on the field and was rocking fully healthy. And even if he wasn't 100% out there, I mean, he was blowing by the Chargers defense, that's for sure, in that first game that he played. And we've seen this, I mean, from him at UCLA, and we saw it from him in his rookie season. Like when he gets the ball out in space, he's a threat after the catch. He's a playmaker. And the discussion surrounding Greg Dulcich feels eerily similar to that of Julius Thomas when he had his first 2 years in the NFL. I know that others have brought this up. I'm not the one bringing this up for the first time, but when Julius Thomas came to the NFL, he was a basketball player who they took a shot on in the 4th round, and we didn't see him for the first 2 years of his NFL career due to injury. So everyone's thinking going into 2013, like, you've seen nothing from Julius Thomas, and he was a basketball player. So what has he ever done as a football player? How is he possibly going to fit into the Peyton Manning offense of all offenses? Then he goes out there and becomes one of the most dominant tight ends in the league. So, I mean, you just never know when a guy does get a streak of good health, and they're talented like Greg Dulcich, they can really put it together and impact a team. So all that to say, I do think we're going to see him back, and I think we're going to see him this year with a big chip on his shoulder.
I think that chip is massive. Like, I can't even understate it enough because, I mean, Greg's season hears everything. Look, as much as players try to tune out what we're saying in terms of media, they see everything. Like, they can post a picture on Instagram with like a loved one and someone's going to comment, you can't stay healthy, the team should cut you. Like, they can't escape a lot of the criticism that surrounds the narrative around them. And, it's frustrating for Greg, but I think, as you mentioned, in terms of that chip, like, Greg's season hears everything. Greg wants to be out there. He wants to play, and he knows that there are guys like Lucas Kroll and Adam Troutman that are currently getting reps ahead of him. And then you have some other young guys that aren't as fully developed yet, like Nate Adkins or Thomas Yasmin at this point. And Greg knows, like, hey, this might be my only opportunity to really showcase that I can be part of the Broncos long term. But Greg isn't just fighting for an opportunity to stay on the Denver Broncos. He's fighting for an opportunity to stay in the National Football League, because if your career is summarized by injury, you can't make the club from the tub, it's a hard narrative to come back from. I mean, let's look at some other guys in recent memory. Remember how good Tariq Cohen was at the running back position when he was a member of the Chicago Bears before he had that major knee injury? And now he's been a guy who's been trying to fight to get on a roster for the past couple of years, but that narrative has kind of followed him around. And look, now, he's going to get a training camp opportunity. Greg is almost in the same position to be in that category, which isn't necessarily his fault, as we want to pinpoint. Injuries are never really a player's fault, to the point where, unless they're like not doing stuff away from the field to take care of their body and nutrition. But as we've all heard from Sean Payton, he likes players at certain weights. And so he's very, very strict. He's very on top of their nutrition. And I think that's a really big thing to have here, because it's an underrated aspect of where Denver's at. When it comes to Greg's just got, like, this is just the freak downside of having really good athletic genetics in terms of fast twitch muscle fibers. Like, sometimes you can be too fast for your own good. And that has unfortunately been the reality here for Greg. So I'm with you, Sayre. I do believe that we see Greg return to the practice field here this week. I imagine it'll probably be in the same basis we're seeing Tim Patrick right now, where maybe he participates in individual with the tight ends, and then he goes and he catches passes on air. But when it gets to the team period, I would not expect him here this week to be doing much of anything in that regard. I think they'll save that for training camp, like they'll also do that for Tim Patrick as well. They're going to ease the guys coming off of injuries back into the mix here. But look, hey, Sayre, I'm excited because Broncos mandatory minicamp is here. We get 3 straight days of access to practice, which means there's going to be a lot of storylines coming out of it. Who's looking sharp, who's not. The quarterback competition, obviously a major talking point here, and we'll have Broncos country covered every step of the way. But before we get to mandatory minicamp, to kind of set the table for Tuesday's practice, we'll give you on tomorrow's episode of the show a preview at 3 young players that we have our eyes on this week as the Broncos report for mandatory minicamp. You get that much more wherever you get your podcasts, or available on YouTube on tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.